The Ghost of Mohammed Din by Clark Ashton Smith, one of his earliest stories, written at age 17 but unpublished until 1970. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. I'll wager 100 rupees that you won't stay there overnight, said Nicholson. It was late in the afternoon and we were seated on the veranda of my friend's bungalow in the Begum suburb at Hyderabad. Our conversation had turned to ghosts, on which subject I was at the time rather skeptical, and Nicholson, after relating a number of blood-curdling stories, had finished by remarking that a nearby house, which was said to be haunted, would give me an excellent chance to put the matter to the test. "Done," I answered, laughing. "It's no joking matter," said my friend seriously. "However, if you really wish to encounter the ghost, I can easily secure you the necessary permission. The house, a 6-roomed bungalow owned by one Yusuf Ali Bora, is tenanted only by the spirit who appears to regard it as his exclusive property. 2 years ago it was occupied by a Muslim merchant named Mohammed Din and his family and servants. One morning they found the merchant dead, stabbed through the heart, and no trace of his murderer, whose identity still remains unrevealed. Mohammed Din's people left and the place was let to a Parsi up from Bombay on business. He vacated the premises abruptly about midnight and told a wild tale the next morning of having encountered a number of disembodied spirits, describing the chief one as Mohammed Din. Several other people took the place in turn, but their occupancy was generally of short duration. All told tales similar to the Parsis. Gradually it acquired a bad reputation, and the finding of tenants became impossible. "Have you ever seen the ghost yourself?" I asked. "Yes, I spent a night, or rather part of one, there, for I went out of the window about 1 o'clock. My nerves were not strong enough to stand it any longer. I wouldn't enter the place again for almost any sum of money." Nicholson's story only confirmed my intention of occupying the haunted house. Armed with a firm disbelief in the supernatural and a still firmer intention to prove it all rot, I felt myself equal to all the ghosts, native and otherwise, in India. Of my ability to solve the mystery, if there were any, I was quite assured. "My friend," said Nicholson to Yusuf Ali Bara an hour later, "wishes to spend a night in your haunted bungalow." The person addressed, a fat little Muslim gentleman, looked at me curiously. "The house is at your service, Sahib," he said. "I presume that Nicholson Sahib has told you the experiences of the previous tenants?" I replied that he had. "If the whole thing is not a trumped-up story, there is doubtless some trickery afoot," said I, "and I warn you that the trickster will not come off unharmed. I have a loaded revolver and shall not hesitate to use it if I meet any disembodied spirits." Yusuf's only answer was to shrug his shoulders. He gave us the keys, and we set out for the bungalow, which was only a few minutes' walk distant. Night had fallen when we reached it. Nicholson unlocked the door, and we entered, and lighting a lamp I had brought with me, set out on a tour of inspection. The furniture consisted chiefly of 2 charpoys, 3 tabourets, an old divan quite innocent of cushions, a broken punkah, a 3-legged chair, and a dilapidated rug. Everything was covered with dust, the shutters rattled disconsolately, and the doors creaked. The other rooms were meagerly furnished. I could hear rats running about in the dark. There was a compound adjoining, filled with rank reed and a solitary peepal tree. Nicholson said that the ghost generally appeared in one of the rooms opening upon it, and this I selected as the one in which to spend the night. It was a fitting place for ghosts to haunt. The ceiling sagged listlessly, and the one charpoy which it contained had a wobbly look. "Sleep well," said Nicholson. "You will find the atmosphere of this spirit-ridden place most conducive to slumber." "Rats," said I. "Yes, there are plenty of rats here," he answered as he went out. Placing the lamp on a tabouret, I lay down with some misgivings as to its stability on the charpoy. Happily, these proved unfounded, and laying my revolver close at hand, I took out a newspaper and began to read. Several hours passed, and nothing unusual happened. The ghost failed to materialize, and about 11, with my fine skepticism greatly strengthened, and feeling a trifle ashamed concerning the 100 rupees which my friend would have to hand over the next morning, I lay down and tried to go to sleep. I had no doubt that my threat about the revolver to Yusuf Ali Bora had checked any plans for scaring me that might have been entertained. Scarcely were my eyes closed when all the doors and windows, which had been creaking and rattling all evening, took on renewed activity. A light breeze had sprung up, and one shutter, which hung only by a single hinge, began to drum a tune on the wall. The rats scuttled about with redoubled energy, and a particularly industrious fellow gnawed something in the further corner for about an hour. It was manifestly impossible to sleep. I seemed to hear whisperings in the air, and once thought that I detected faint footsteps going and coming through the empty rooms. A vague feeling of eeriness crept upon me, and it required a very strong mental effort to convince myself that these sounds were entirely due to imagination. Finally, the breeze died down, the loose shutter ceased to bang, the rats stopped gnawing, and comparative quiet being restored, I fell asleep. 2 hours later, I woke, and taking out my watch, saw, though the lamp had begun to burn dimly, that the hands pointed to 2 o'clock. I was about to turn over when again I heard the mysterious footsteps, this time quite audibly. They seemed to approach my room, but when I judged them to be in the next apartment, ceased abruptly. I waited 5 minutes in a dead silence with my nerves on edge and my scalp tingling. Then I became aware that there was something between me and the opposite wall. At first it was a dim shadow, but as I watched it darkened into a body. A sort of phosphorescent light emanated from it, surrounding it with pale radiance. The lamp flared up and went out, but the figure was still visible. It was that of a tall native dressed in flowing white robes and a blue turban. He wore a bushy beard and had eyes like burning coals of fire. His gaze was directed intently upon me, and I felt cold shivers running up and down my spine. I wanted to shriek, but my tongue seemed glued to the roof of my mouth. The figure stepped forward, and I noticed that the robe was red at the breast as though with blood. This, then, was the ghost of Mohammed Din. Nicholson's story was true, and for a moment my conviction that the supernatural was all nonsense went completely to pieces. Only momentarily, however, for I remembered that I had a revolver, and the thought gave me courage. Perhaps it was a trick after all, and anger arose in me, and a resolve not to let the trickster escape unscathed. I raised the weapon with a quick movement and fired. The figure being not over 5 paces distant, it was impossible to miss, but when the smoke had cleared, it had not changed its position. It began to advance, making no sound, and in a few moments was beside the charpoy. With one remaining vestige of courage, I raised my revolver and pulled the trigger 3 times in succession, but without visible effect. I hurled the weapon at the figure's head and heard it crash against the opposite wall an instant later. The apparition, though visible, was without tangibility. Now it began to disappear. Very slowly at first it faded, then more rapidly until I could make out only the bare outlines. Another instant and all was gone but the outline of one hand, which hung motionless in the air. I got up and made a step towards it, then stopped abruptly, for the outlines again began to fill in, the hand to darken and solidify. Now I noticed something I had not seen before. A heavy gold ring, set with some green gem, probably an emerald, appeared to be on the middle finger. The hand began to move slowly past me towards the door opening into the next apartment. Lighting the lamp, I followed, all fear being thrown aside and desiring to find the explanation of the phenomenon. I could hear faint footfalls beneath the hand, as though the owner, though invisible, were still present. I followed it through the adjoining apartment and into the next, where it again stopped and hung motionless. One finger was pointed toward the further corner, where stood a taboret or stand. Impelled, I think, by some force other than my own volition, I went over and, lifting the taboret, found a small wooden box covered with dust beneath. Turning about, I saw that the hand had disappeared. Taking the box with me, I returned to my room. The thing was made of very hard wood, and in size was perhaps 10 inches in length by 8 in width and 4 in height. It was light, and the contents rustled when I shook it. I guessed them to be letters or papers, but having nothing to pry the box open with, I concluded to wait until morning before trying to. Strange as it may seem, I soon fell asleep. You would naturally think that a man would not feel inclined to slumber immediately after encountering a disembodied spirit. I can give no explanation of it. The sun was streaming through the window when I awoke, and so cheerful and matter-of-fact was the broad daylight that I wondered if the events of the night were not all a dream. The presence of the box, however, convinced me that they were not. Nicholson came in and appeared much surprised and a trifle discomfited to find me still in possession. "Well," he inquired, "what happened? What did you see?" I told him what had occurred and produced the box as proof. An hour afterwards, Nicholson, with a short native sword and considerable profanity, was trying to pry the thing open. He finally succeeded. Within were a number of closely written sheets of paper and some letters, most of which were addressed to Mohammed Din. The papers were mostly in the form of memoranda and business accounts, such as would be made by a merchant. They were written in execrable Urdu, hopelessly jumbled together, and though all were dated, it was no small task to sort them out. The letters were mostly regarding business affairs, but several, which were written in a very fair hand, were from a cousin of Mohammed Din's, one Ali Bag, an Agra horse trader. These two, with one exception, were commonplace enough. Nicholson knitted his brows as he read it and then handed it to me. The greater part, being of little interest, has escaped my memory, but I recollect that last paragraph that ran thus: "I do not understand how you came by the knowledge, nor why you wish to use it to ruin me. It is all true. If you have any love for me, forbear." "What does that mean?" asked Nicholson. "What secret did Mohammed Din possess that he could have used to ruin his cousin?" We went through the memoranda carefully, and near the bottom found the following, dated April 21st, 1881, according to our notation. "Today I found the letters which I have long been seeking. They are ample proof of what I have long known, but have hitherto been unable to substantiate, that Ali Bag is a counterfeiter, the chief of a large band. I have but to turn them over to the police, and he will be dragged away to jail, there to serve a term of many years. It will be good revenge, part compensation at least, for the injuries he has done me." "That explains Ali Bag's letter," said Nicholson. "Mohammed was boastful enough to write to him, telling him that he knew of his guilt and intended to prove it." Next were several sheets in a different hand and signed Malik Khan. Malik Khan, it seemed, was a friend of Ali Bag's, and the sheets were in the form of a letter, but being without fold, it was quite evident that they had not been posted. The communication related to certain counterfeiting schemes, and the names of a number of men implicated appeared. This, plainly, was the proof alluded to by Mohammed, and which he had threatened his cousin to turn over to the police. There was nothing else of interest save the following in Mohammed's hand, dated April 17th, 1881. "Tomorrow I shall give the papers to the authorities. I have delayed too long and was very foolish to write to Ali Bag. I passed a man in the street today who bore a resemblance to my cousin. I could not be sure, but if he is here, then may Allah help me, for he will hesitate at nothing." What followed was illegible. "On the night of April 21st, said Nicholson, "Mohammed was killed by a person or persons unknown." He paused, and then he went on. "This Ali Bag is a man with whom I have had some dealings in horses, and an especially vicious crook it was that he got 300 rupees out of me for. He has a bad reputation as a horse dealer, and the Agra police have long been patiently seeking evidence of his implication in several bold counterfeiting schemes. Malik Khan, one of his accomplices, was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, but refused to turn state's evidence on Ali Bag. The police are convinced that Ali Bag was as much, if not more, implicated than Malik Khan, but they can do nothing for lack of proof. The turning over of these papers, however, as poor Mohammed would have done had he lived, will lead to his arrest and conviction. It was Ali Bag who killed Mohammed. I am morally convinced, his motive, of course, being to prevent the disclosure of his guilt. Your extraordinary experience last night and the murdered man's papers point to it. Yet we can prove nothing, and your tale would be laughed at in court." Some blank sheets remained in the bottom of the box, and my friend tilted them out as he spoke. They fluttered to the veranda, and something rolled out from amongst them and lay glittering in the sunshine. It was a heavy gold ring set with an emerald, the very same that I had seen upon the apparition's finger several hours before. A week or so later, as the result of the papers that Nicholson sent to the Agra police, accompanied by an explanatory note, one Ali Bag, horse trader, found himself on trial, charged with counterfeiting. It was a very short trial, his character and reputation going badly against him, and it being proven that he was the leader of the gang of which Malik Khan was thought to be a member. He was sentenced to a somewhat longer term in jail than his accomplice. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.